All right, welcome to The Otherppl Show, a weekly podcast featuring in-depth interviews with today's leading writers. I'm Brad Listi here in Los Angeles. Good to be with you. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe to this show wherever you get your podcasts. You can also subscribe on YouTube. Follow the show on social media, TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, and Blue Sky. So today is Friday, and I'm going to be doing a flashback, as usual, digging into the archives and sharing an outtake from an episode out of the past. Today, I'm going to be sharing an outtake from episode 774, my conversation with author Kathryn Miles. It first aired on May 25th, 2022. Kathryn Miles is the author of a book called Trailed, One Woman's Quest to Solve the Shenandoah Murders. I'm flashing back to this episode and my conversation with Kathryn Miles today because there has been a break in this case, and the Shenandoah Murders, which happened in 1996, have now been solved, it looks like. For those of you who are unaware of this case or missed this episode when it first aired, the Shenandoah Murders happened in Shenandoah National Park in Virginia. 2 female hikers were brutally murdered in May of that year. Their names are Julianne Williams and Lolly Winans. They were a couple, and their deaths were deeply traumatic for the LGBTQ community in particular, but for any decent person, it was a horror. And it has a personal connection for me, or a bit of one, because I hiked, as you know, the Appalachian Trail, or as many of you know. I hiked a good bit of the trail in the summer of 1997, and I very clearly recall seeing signs in Shenandoah National Park about these killings. And, people, the signs were asking if you had any information, please contact the authorities. It was that kind of thing. And it was a bit unsettling, as you can imagine, to be camping in the park and to see these signs tacked up. And so I was very interested in speaking with Kathryn Miles, who did a deep dive investigation into these murders and into the aftermath. And now it looks like there has come a resolution. So it seems a good time to revisit this conversation. I suppose I should let you know that it was advances in DNA testing that led investigators to the killer, a man named Walter Leo Jackson Sr. from the Cleveland area in Ohio. He is actually dead. He died in an Ohio prison in 2018, and he had a long criminal record and a history of sexual assault and all the rest. So, very sad story, but glad that they figured out who did it. And I'm excited to share this outtake with Kathryn Miles with all of you. Kathryn Miles is the author of 5 books. Her essays and articles have appeared in publications such as Audubon, Best American Essays, Best American Sports Writing, the Boston Globe, the New York Times, Outside Magazine, and Time Magazine. A contributing editor at Down East Magazine, Kathryn Miles also serves as a scholar in residence for the Maine Humanities Council and as a faculty member in several MFA programs. A flashback to episode 774, my conversation with Kathryn Miles, is coming up momentarily. A reminder before we get rolling that I do a weekly email newsletter. I would love it if you subscribed over at bradlisti.substack.com, and I would love it if you joined the Otherppl Patreon community, in particular if you are a regular listener of this show. If you appreciate the work that I do, go join the Otherppl Patreon over at patreon.com/otherpplpod. Okay, so today's flashback once again comes from episode 774. It first aired on May 25th, 2022. A reminder that the full episode 774, is available if you want to hear the entire conversation with Kathryn Miles. Just search for it wherever you listen to podcasts. Okay? So without any further ado, let's get to today's flashback. Here I am, back in 2022, talking with Kathryn Miles.
When I went into this project, it was imperative to me from a moral and an ethical perspective, as well as a narrative one, that Lolly and Julie always remained the main characters of the story. Julie Williams was a young woman who was born and raised in a small Minnesotan town. She had a very close-knit family. She was a little shy and reserved, but super competent at everything that she did. She was fluent in Spanish, and as a high school student had started doing some translating for domestic abuse survivors. And she also had a vested interest in geology, which is what her major ended up being in college. She did a lot of missionary work in Central and South America. She did a lot of geologic work, both in Europe and in northern Minnesota, especially on Native American tribal lands. And so by the time she ended up at this outdoor organization called Woods Women, she had already kind of found a lot of competence for herself, both in terms of the backcountry and also in terms of some pretty hard scrabble places. Lolly Winans, 2 years older, she was 26 when she died. She grew up in a very affluent community in Michigan, a very wealthy family. That family had a lot of, let's say maybe dysfunction to it. As she would later talk about, she was an incest survivor, and coming forward with that story had really broken up the family in a lot of ways. She wandered a little bit after high school, kind of trying to find her niche. She was very outgoing, incredibly charming, had this great, really acerbic wit, loved the Grateful Dead, loved to go to jam band shows, loved to have a bottle of Corona in her hand. And she really found her niche when she arrived at Unity College, this small environmental studies school in central Maine. And at that place, she had committed to this idea that she was going to create a wilderness therapy program that would allow other sexual assault survivors to find the same kind of strength and redemption that she had found on the trail. So she arrived at Woods Women in May of 1995 to do an internship to complete her degree at Unity.
And Woods Women was in Minnesota. That was like Boundary Waters, is that right?
They spent a lot of time in the Boundary Waters. They were they were based right outside of Minneapolis. And it was this really wonderful organization that had been created as sort of a corrective to Outward Bound, the National Outdoor Leadership School, these other sort of hierarchical outward schools. So Woods Women came out of folks who had an experience either at Knowles or at Outward Bound and thought, this idea of sort of increasing stress in a participant's experience really kind of only works for a certain type of participant. And for other people, especially people who identify as female or non-binary or queer, they're already coming with a level of stress to the wilderness. And so continuously stressing them is really only going to kind of disengage them from that landscape. And so that organization is where Lolly and Julie had met. And by all accounts, it was love at first sight. And so they had this very kind of cozy summer in this very sort of safe, holistic, nurturing, consensus-based environment where they felt really fairly safe being outwardly in love. And then as the summer came to an end, had to sort of confront the challenge of what is it to be LGBTQ plus in 1996, and how are we going to manage that?
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the things that I had to confront when I was reading, was thinking about where gay rights were in the 90s. It was a much different world. I like to think of my college years in Boulder as this sort of like wide open, free progressive time or whatever, but it wasn't. I mean, maybe it was in those little bubbles, but it certainly wasn't that way as broadly as it is now, though I guess things are maybe regressing, or they're trying to push things back, certain factions are anyway. But in the 90s, it was not necessarily as simple to be out and open and public about your gay relationship.
Not at all. And as I say in the preface of the book, I think it's really important to sort of consider and remind ourselves of the zeitgeist of the time. We have multiple states who are passing anti-sodomy laws. We have the Supreme Court affirming those laws. We're still really in the thick of the HIV scare for a lot of people. And this is the murder of Lolly and Julie is about 2.5 years before the murder of Matthew Shepard. And so there's a lot of very sort of anti-gay sentiment that's sort of reverberating through the country at this time.
Yeah, there was some, I think you documented in your book, was it an anti-sodomy law that passed in Colorado during that time? Or is that right?
That was right. And Oregon had narrowly defeated a very similar law that was basically going to make homosexual behavior, and I put that in scare quotes, illegal.
Wow. So not maybe the totally warm, fuzzy place that I like to remember, as I'm idealizing my college days. And Lolly and Julie were both abuse survivors. I think you mentioned Lolly being an incest survivor and how difficult that must have been. And then Julie herself was a date rape survivor, as were you, which you write about in the book. And you're also an outdoors woman. You love the outdoors and have gotten, I think, a lot of the same comfort and insight from the outdoors that Lolly and Julie got in their lifetimes. So those are the obvious lines of connection for you to these young women and to this story.
That's right. And I think you and I are probably just about contemporaries, because I graduated from college in 1996. And I had, prior to that final year of my studies, I had really struggled to come to terms with what had also been a date rape when I was 16 years old. And I hadn't told anyone. And as I say in the book, I went through what I now understand are a lot of fairly common responses, like this must have somehow been my fault, or I must have done something wrong, or I must have somehow brought this on myself. And so for those last 2 years of high school and then my first 2 years of college, I was battling with emotional scars that I didn't even understand I was battling with. And my initial response to all of that was just to try as hard as I could to get out of my body. And so I was studying the most esoteric theology and philosophy that I could. I was just rail thin. I was, I think 100 pounds, by that time, and just anything I could to sort of avoid my bodily self. But then I was taking an environmental studies course that had a mandatory backpacking trip on it. And I was totally unprepared. I had no idea what I was doing, but I really fell in love with the concept of backpacking and the idea that you could literally just sort of shoulder your most essential provisions and what you needed and supplies. And you could go out in the wilderness and you could feel strong and safe and empowered. And it was in that moment that I really found a way back into my own body. And so I had just newly discovered this sort of beautiful pastime that I kind of saw as my salvation. And then when I learned about these two murders and the murders of another very similar couple that had occurred also just off the Appalachian Trail, it really shattered my sense of security in the wilderness and really changed my approach to, all kinds of backcountry activities.
Yeah, so this murder that you're referring to, I believe, is the one that took place at the Thelma Mark shelter in Pennsylvania on a section of the Appalachian Trail.
That's actually a third. I was actually talking about the murder of Claudia Brenner and Rebecca Wright, which Claudia Brenner documents in a really amazing book called 8 Bullets.
Oh,
but
right.
Yes, the Thelma Marks is actually the third murder.
I can't keep track, to be honest. Like, I was going through your book after I'd read it, and there's so much going on. There's a complexity to trying to solve a cold case crime. And also, there's a complexity, just a basic fundamental complexity to unpacking all the different violent crimes that have taken place in the wilderness, which is one of the more unnerving aspects of your book. We like to think of the wilderness as being a safe place, removed from the perils of society and the inner city and all that goes along with it. And I suppose, like, maybe statistically it is, but it's like this book and these stories call it into question.
One of the things that I can hope that this book might be able to do, I really hope that it can spark a larger conversation about this issue of both equity and equality and access to wilderness, and then also safety in the wilderness. And one of the really disturbing things that I learned when I was researching the book was not just that violent crimes are underreported in our national parks and our other sort of national wilderness places, but there is no codified system for reporting crimes in the parks. It's sort of an ad hoc park by park system. And as both the Government Accountability Office and also the Inspector General of the Department of the Interior has found, is that these crimes are not getting reported. And similarly, instances of harassment, sexual assault, bad behavior that's occurring employee on employee in these parks is also radically underreported. You know, we've seen some exposés that have been done in the past 5 years. Outside Magazine did a really big one looking at the Colorado River and the Grand Canyon and the pervasiveness of sexual harassment there. But it continues to be a really big problem, and one that I don't even think we really have the data for to really understand.
Yeah. And before we move on any further, I want to go back to you in Pennsylvania, you know, having this great enthusiasm for the outdoors and then, you know, being on a section of the Appalachian Trail there and learning about this killing. It was, if I'm remembering this right, one person was killed, the other person survived. Is that right?
That's the Claudia Brenner case. The case that you're referring to at the Thelma Marks was a young couple, Molly LaRue and Jeff Hood, who had also been through hiking the trail. And they had stopped at this original, really kind of folksy old shelter that was known as the Thelma Marks shelter. And there they encountered a man who immediately murdered Jeff and then really brutally raped Molly repeatedly before he murdered her, disposed of their bodies sort of back behind the shelter, took their gear, and then just continued hiking down the trail and wasn't apprehended until he got all the way down to Harper's Ferry.
When was this again in time?
Yeah, and I'm going to have to guess on that. I'm going to say that was late 80s, early 90s, but I would have to look it up to be sure. It was before Lolly and Julie. So I was going to graduate school out at the University of Delaware, which was right, you know, in the foothills of the trail. And I would spend a lot of my weekends and school breaks backpacking. And as I write in the book, it was a November day in 1998 that I was doing a section hike. And I had stopped for what I thought would be the night at the Thelma Marks shelter. And I was, you know, in my sort of sanctimonious way, really sort of distraught to see that the Appalachian Trail crew were building a brand new shelter. And I thought, oh God, this is like this relic of, you know, the original trail, and how could they possibly tear it down? And I have this conversation with one of the trail crew workers who says to me, well, you know, we have to tear it down because of the murder. And he then unpacks the story of Molly and Jeff, and I'm sitting right there, you know, and in that moment it was just so inconceivable to me that something so terrible and brutal could happen in this place that I thought of as sort of, you know, pastoral and almost sort of otherworldly in its safety. And, you know, I didn't sleep a wink that night. I got home. We didn't even have Google then, right? So I was using, Alta Vista to kind of look up, and I start to learn about these murders. And that was actually the first time I had learned of Lolly and Julie's murder. Somehow with college graduation and everything else like that, I had missed it the first time around, despite the fact that it was national news. And so now I'm sitting with this collection of murders on or near the Appalachian Trail, many of which, you know, include women, multiple of which include women who identify as queer. And I'm sitting there thinking, how could I possibly ever go back out on the trail again?
Okay, that was Kathryn Miles in episode 774, which first aired on May 25th, 2022. A reminder that the full episode is available, so if you like what you just heard and you want to go in for more, just search for episode 774 wherever you get your podcasts. You can find out more about Kathryn Miles and her work at kathrynmiles.net. Follow her on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Don't forget to subscribe to the Otherppl Show wherever you listen. Hit the subscribe button. You can also subscribe on YouTube. Follow me on social media, TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, and Blue Sky. Sign up for my weekly email newsletter over at bradlisti.substack.com. Join the Otherppl Patreon community over at patreon.com/otherpplpod. Help keep this show going into the future. And if you want to help me out a bit, if you have 2 minutes, please give this show a rating wherever you listen. So Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever it is, rate the show, review the show. It helps the show find new listeners. To get an Otherppl t-shirt or to join my book club, visit the show's official website, otherppl.com. And if you would like to read my latest book, it is a novel called Be Brief and Tell Them Everything, available in trade paperback, ebook, and audiobook editions. I narrate the audiobook. So read my book if that sounds good. Again, it's called Be Brief and Tell Them Everything. All right, so coming up on Monday, there will be a monologue. Monologue Mondays have returned. I got to figure out what I'm going to say. I still don't have a clue, so stay tuned.